Well, good afternoon. My name is Adrian Bertrand from Six Capitals Advisory. We're delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, funded by the UK PACT South Africa. We're looking forward to some discussions around governing and managing climate risk. And it's our great pleasure to host you today along with our project partner. Before we go into the formal program for today, maybe just to mention a few administrative issues. Please do mute your line and turn off your video if you're not speaking. We'd encourage you to please interact with our speakers. Please place your comments or your questions in the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that during the course of the webinar. And we'd love to be able to deal with pertinent questions as and when they come up. So we will be monitoring the Q&A box, and our speakers will be very keen to respond to any questions that you may want to raise. We will also be having a Q&A section in the agenda, so please do feel free to interact and either ask your questions via the chat function or indicate so, and we can give you the opportunity to speak audibly in terms of any question or comment that you may wish to make. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded. The links to the webinar recordings are going to be made available via the DNA project website, and we'll provide those links to you via email after today. Hopefully you won't have any technical challenges, but I know Zoom has been challenging folk this week. Please contact safako@apros.coza if you have any technical challenges during the webinar. We're very grateful for your time today, and we look forward to your active participation in today's webinar. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome our representative from the British High Commission, Mr. Thapelo Tladi. Thapelo will provide some opening remarks on behalf of the British High Commission and on behalf of UK PACT. Thapelo is a geoscientist, an energy and sustainability professional. His interests and professional experience include climate change mitigation policy and economics, renewable energy development, and sustainable natural resource management. Thapelo has experience in these areas across the mining industry, management consulting, and international development. In Thapelo's current role at the British High Commission, he works for the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in Pretoria, where he is the head of the UK PACT and International Climate Finance Programs in the Climate Change and Energy team. We're also delighted to introduce Corley LaRue, who will be presenting along with Melanie Smith in terms of today's theme, governance, managing governance and climate risk. Corley is a certified director of the Institute of Directors of Southern Africa. She's an independent ESG consultant, and she's also an associate of Six Capitals Advisory. Corley has previously served as the head of sustainability at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and she's currently a member of the Global Reporting Initiative's Global Sustainability Standards Board, or GWSB. And the GWSB oversees the development of the GRI Sustainability Reporting Standards. Corley also serves on the Integrated Reporting Committee of South Africa's working group that develops guidance on integrated reporting for South African companies. Corley is a member of the King 4 subcommittee on climate change, and she'll be sharing with us the latest guidance paper that's been issued late last week by the IODSA around director responsibilities in climate change. And Corley also supports ASISA in supporting the CRESA Code and CRESA Secretariat with the drafting of a new CRESA Code for South Africa. We very much look forward to having Corley speak to us today. Joining Corley as part of the presentation in today's webinar, we have Melanie Smith. Melanie is the practice head for research and reporting, also at Six Capitals Advisory. In this role, Melanie heads up the ESG research and reporting capability in supporting Six Capitals clients, such as this specific UK PACT project, with ESG research and reporting guidance. Melanie also led our team for the WWF and Sanlam funded research project into the uptake of the TCFD framework in South Africa, which saw Melanie and others engaging with more than 30 stakeholders around their approach to the TCFD framework. Melani's recently completed her Master's in Sustainability at the Sustainability Institute of the University of Stellenbosch, and we're very excited to also hear what Melanie will be sharing with us in today's webinar. With that, I'm going to invite Thapelo to provide a brief introduction to UK PACT and to also provide us with some opening remarks. Thank you, Thapelo.
Thank you, Adrian. Welcome everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this webinar as part of this PACT funded project. As Adrian said, I just want to introduce UK PACT and provide some opening remarks about our support for this project. So I think for those of you who are unfamiliar with UK PACT, the program stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. It's a £60 million program running in multiple countries, including South Africa, mostly emerging economies like South Africa, Malaysia, Mexico, Colombia, China, as well as Nigeria and Kenya. The program is funded by the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it's part of a portfolio of programs we run, which are broadly funded by the UK's International Climate Finance. The ultimate mandate or aim of UK PACT is to support the countries I mentioned in helping them achieve their NDC commitments, and also I think broadly to help us achieve the Paris Agreement. The program is demand driven, and what we mean by that is that all the projects we support, as well as the other interventions I'll talk about in a minute, are all based on country demand. So we work with government stakeholders, mostly in these countries, to conceive our projects and our interventions and to work in areas that support their priorities and their needs. I think next slide, Adrian, thank you. So in terms of how UK PACT is structured broadly, it's structured across 3 components. And these are country programs, the Green Recovery Challenge Fund and Skill Shares and Secondments. The country programs component of the program operates in a number of countries, as I mentioned before. And this is a project-based technical assistance and capacity building facility where we provide grant funding for projects like this one to work with, to support government stakeholders in those countries. Again, these are demand-driven projects and most of them are providing technical assistance in a particular area of need. In South Africa, I'll go into this in the next slide, but the areas we focus on in South Africa are energy, and within energy, we look at renewable energy development, we look at the just energy transition, and we also look at energy efficiency and demand side management. We also look at sustainable transport, sustainable finance, climate smart agriculture, as well as climate policy. The other 2 components of the program that we focus on are the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and this is a similar type of facility as the country programs component, except that the projects we fund there are more regional in nature and support basically multiple countries across a particular theme or issue. And then the last component we also work in are skill shares and secondments. And this is where we basically bring UK experts, public sector and private sector experts across a number of climate and energy themes together with their local counterparts in various countries like ours to build each other's capacity in particular areas. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, our program is still fairly new. Our program was really started in 2019, but we launched our program portfolio, project portfolio rather, in 2020. And the current portfolio of projects we're supporting are across 3 areas: sustainable finance, sustainable transport and energy. And at present, the projects that we're supporting are worth just over £3 million. And we will be looking to support more projects going forward. As you can see from that quote there, I think this program really is highly supported by the British High Commission here locally, but as well as the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. Next slide. So I think to get an understanding of the sort of work we do under UK PACT, as well as the sort of projects we're supporting, you can visit the UK PACT the UK PACT website and go to the South Africa country page. And I think from there, you can get a quick snapshot of the sort of work we do and also the sort of projects we support, like this current project. Specific information on this project can be found at the DNA Economics website, where you will get more insight into this project, as well as kind of the sort of work the project consortium is undertaking. I think in terms of our support for this project, we see it as an extremely key project in the context of climate-related financial disclosure becoming an extremely important topic globally. And I think more so even heading up to COP, and where climate finance and green finance will be quite topical. Projects like this are very timely, and we also see our support for them hopefully as helping, I think, the discourse on this topic here locally. So I think, Adrian, I think I'll leave it there. And once again, thank you everyone for joining this webinar and for supporting this project.
Thank you very much, Thapelo. We really do appreciate the British High Commission and UK PACT support of this project in particular, but also the other projects that are underway in South Africa. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to introduce this specific project. But before I go into a project overview, and I am mindful of the fact that a lot of you have already joined us for previous webinars in the series, so we'll try and cover it fairly briefly, but we also know that there are people joining this webinar for the first time. A reminder for any trustees or principal officers that may be joining today, we have formal Batseta CPD accreditation for 2 CPD hours. So if you would like to claim those 2 CPD hour credits, please would you get in touch with us, and we'll just need your ID number and your full names, and we're happy to issue you with a CPD certificate as issued by Batseta. Also to mention that we have the next webinar theme in the series taking place tomorrow, Thursday, the 26th of August at 10 o'clock South African time in the morning. And that's going to be looking at the impacts of climate risk. Tomorrow's webinar, and we'll have a repeat webinar on the same theme next week, is being led and facilitated by WWF South Africa. And we'd encourage you to register to attend that webinar if you haven't had a chance to do so as yet. Again, a reminder to please make sure to use the Q&A function to ask any questions or make any comments. And our project partners will also be loading in the chat function links to both the DNA website, where you can access project resources, as well as links to some of the references and sources that will be used in the presentation delivered by Corley and Milani. So let me just take a few minutes to provide a project overview of this particular South Africa-UK PACT funded project. As Thapelo mentioned, this is also taking the lead from UK PACT's approach, where it needs to be a demand-led process. And so this project, which is focusing on climate-related financial disclosures and South Africa's investor community from an asset manager and retirement fund perspective, we really are seeking to develop tools and resources which will assist South African financial sector players, specifically asset managers and retirement funds, in further improving their integration of climate risk into their investment strategy, as well as contributing to improved climate risk disclosures in South Africa. Our project team of local and international partners has significant industry experience, both from a climate risk specific perspective, as well as for a broader ESG policy and landscape view in terms of South Africa's ESG landscape. And so the project's objective is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and timeous climate-related disclosures for investment decision-making in South Africa. We're going to do this by partnering and supplementing and enhancing some of the other related initiatives focusing on TCFD, which are currently underway in South Africa, many of which are also enjoying the funding support of UK PACT, as well as some of the other initiatives which are underway by National Treasury, for example. The primary focus for this project is transition risk and how it impacts on listed equities as the asset class, and its impact on asset manager and pension fund investment portfolios. We are keen to run a subsequent phase of this project in 2022, which will hopefully enable us to expand the scope of the project to consider other asset classes such as fixed income or unlisted investments, and to also incorporate guidance for other entities in the financial sector, such as banks, insurance companies, etc. What we are doing, however, in this project is trying to address physical risk as best we can in order to determine how we will be able to address climate risk more comprehensively, physical climate risk more comprehensively in phase 2 of this project. Briefly, this project is led by DNA Economics as the project consortium lead, supported by the Greenhouse, Vivid Economics, WWF South Africa, and Six Capitals Advisory. DNA Economics has for more than a decade been advising both government as well as private sector entities around climate change policy. The Greenhouse has also been advising corporate and public sector clients on sustainability assessments and climate change strategies. Vivid Economics and WWF SA are our international partners, obviously partnering with WWF South Africa. Vivid Economics is a global economics and consultancy firm with offices around the world. And Vivid Economics is a leader in terms of developing climate models, which can be used in scenario analysis. WWF is one of the world's leading conservation organizations, probably doesn't need too much of an introduction, and we are enjoying the benefit of the technical expertise from WWF South Africa's sustainable finance team. Six Capitals Advisory, where myself, Milani, and Corley sit, is an ESG advisory business. We're part of the same group as DNA Economics under the Alternative Prosperity Group, and we work with South African corporates and investors in integrating ESG into investment decision-making and reporting. There are different opportunities for stakeholders such as yourselves to participate and benefit from the resources and the capacity building initiatives under this project. We have a project steering committee which assists the project team decide on key priorities and approaches. The steering committee comprises Batseta, ASISA, and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And then we have a broader advisory group, which is well constituted from various entities active in the financial sector, predominantly with links to asset management and retirement funds in South Africa. We produce a number of resources for project stakeholders. This can include literature and communications, webinars such as today's webinar, foundation level training workshops, best practice training workshops, training in scenario analysis, as well as pilots of the toolkit and resources that this project team is developing. And we'd invite you to actively participate in this project, and please do visit the project website hosted by DNA Economics for more information in that regard. Perhaps if I can just make one advert around foundation level training workshops. In September, we are going to be hosting 4 half-day workshops intended for asset managers, where we will be covering the A to Z of climate risk. There will be some examples of good practice disclosure, and we'd invite you, if you are a professional investor or someone from the asset management industry, to please join us for one of those half-day workshops. We'll also be running 2 full-day workshops focused on retirement funds. We'd love to have trustees and principal officers and asset consultants as advisors to retirement funds joining us for those 2 full-day sessions. And more information on those workshop opportunities will be shared with you after today's webinar. We have 3 main work streams to this project. The first is about capacity building and awareness, helping South African financial sector stakeholders understand climate-related financial impacts. We're looking at the workshops that we'll be scheduling over the course of the next month and a bit, which will include towards the end an introduction to the toolkit, which is being developed by the project team, appropriate scenarios for South African investors, as well as best practice guides and good practice disclosure examples around TCFD aligned reporting. And again, these will be disseminated via webinars, workshops, and half-day and full-day workshop sessions. In terms of our analysis and reporting toolkit, here again, it's important that we do research and analysis with respect to South African specific climate risk information. Work is underway around scenario development guidance, for which we will also be engaging with the asset manager community to understand your views on the scenarios that are being proposed. And again, making these tools available to investors, which would include things like disclosure templates and checklists. Lastly, we've also done research on 50 of the JSE top 50 listed companies, looking at the extent of their climate-related financial disclosures. Those 50 fact sheets are also available via the project website, and you're welcome to download those fact sheets. And again, we will be providing examples of good practice, both in the workshops taking place in September, as well as in the toolkit that will be shared with project stakeholders in due course. We'd encourage you to download the TCFD-focused fact sheets on those 50 JSE listed companies. We've also developed a number of publications under the Atleha brand, which is really climate-related financial disclosure, foundational information, focused on trustees and other kind of lay investors. And please do download those resources and do feel free to share them with your industry colleagues and networks. Vivid Economics and DNA Economics have also led 2 pieces of research, which have also been published into research reports. These reports are also available via the DNA website. These reports look at the state of climate-related financial disclosure, both internationally and in South Africa, with a few findings and recommendations in each report. So please do visit the website, and do also feel free to get in touch should you have any questions. With that, I'm going to invite Melanie and Corley to present to us for the bulk of today's webinar around governance, the importance of governance when it comes to managing and addressing climate risk. Thank you very much, Melanie and Corley.
Thanks, Adrian and Tabela, for the introductions to the project, and also just some of the resources and tools that are available. Yeah, so I think just to, before I get started, I believe Sefako is ready for us just one opinion poll, if I'm correct, to start us off with. And the question around the opinion poll is, does your organization's board or highest governing body currently exercise oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities? Okay, so it seems at the moment, while people are answering that poll, that it's almost a 50-50 between a yes and a no. No, okay. It seems that, yeah, we're almost, yes is leading the pack again. Okay. It seems that most companies or most individuals on this call are looking at climate risk and opportunities. Great. So let's get started. I quickly want to start us off with, I'm mindful, like Adrian mentioned, there are individuals that have attended our previous webinars on theme 1 and 2. And yeah, I think just for those that have not been able to attend those sessions, it might be useful to just do a recap of the theme 1 and 2 topics that we covered in the last couple of webinars. So in our theme 1 sessions, we hosted those together with WWF. We had a quick look at some introductory concepts around climate change and why there is such an urgent need for improved disclosure by companies and investors alike, to be able to disclose quality and comparable climate data. The work that was presented by CERN and WWF's Louise Nadir showed that climate change, or it just reaffirmed that climate change is as a result of human activities. And this has also been reaffirmed by the latest IPCC report that was published the last 2 weeks back. So yeah, we saw that climate change is one of the top risks faced by our generation, as the impacts of climate change will be extensive. And that's particularly applicable to our more marginalized groups in societies. Now, Louise touched on that briefly in her section, and we were aware of the fact that these groups typically are more disproportionately affected by these effects that we're seeing from climate change, such as droughts, floods, and various other extreme events. And companies and investors have a pivotal role in addressing climate change. There's various ways they can do that, but some of these do include where they invest their capital from an investor perspective, and then from a company perspective, improve disclosure of climate-related information so that investors are able to make better informed investment decisions, that then enables them to also contribute and steer and address climate change through that mechanism, and to drive our transition to a low carbon economy. And yeah, just on the theme 2 session, we also looked at, and that the latter part of our theme 1 webinar, we had a look at different players within the reporting landscape. And yeah, it was noted that it is a complex problem to tackle, to be able to comprehensively address and provide a solution for corporate reporting. And then we had a look at frameworks such as the TCFD and the CDP, and how those two link to one another, and the fact that CDP, the historic reporting that's been done using CDP as a framework, a disclosure framework, has been particularly useful for those that want to align themselves with the TCFD recommendations, to be able to do so in the coming months, or those that have already started that process. And we also had a look at some of the global and local drivers of climate disclosure, and what some of the uptake has been globally, which we saw 2020 has been a crucial year in uptake around the TCFD framework in particular globally. And then locally, we quickly ran through some of the research, 6 capitals together with WWF, and also as part of this project, DNA Economics has done around how we are progressing locally in terms of our performance or disclosure performance. And we quickly ran through some of the barriers that are unfortunately, currently holding back good quality disclosure of climate data. I see there's one comment in the chat. Oh, it's just Adrian mentioning that people are you're welcome to post your comments or questions in the chat function as we're going through it. Yeah, let's quickly then get into some of the almost primer info that I'd like to share with you guys before quarterly runs into some of the governance work we're presenting. And I think it's important to, as a collective on this call today, just have a good idea around what are some of the risks and opportunities that go together with climate change, and what's the potential financial impacts, both of the risks and opportunities that organizations can potentially face, and to keep that in the back of our mind as we head into the conversation around board and director duties, because this is a strategic risk that businesses need to manage in order to be able to address that risk from a strategic perspective. So let's quickly just have a look. So the TCFD framework buckets climate risk into main categories, namely physical risk and transition risk. And I think it's just worth noting that these risks relate inward to organizations as opposed to the outward impact of that particular entity. When one talks about physical and transition risk, and physical risk is very aptly named, is the risk that results from the financial, or the risk that result from climate change, and how that will impact the financial performance of an entity currently or in the future. And these are crop up as a result of increased physical risk that is driven by increased concentrations of GHG emissions in the atmosphere, which result in increases in average global surface temperatures, with some areas warming more than others, and other areas have the opposite, or experience the opposite in cooler weather. So global warming in turn then leads to extreme weather events like droughts and floods and hurricanes and so forth. And with these events, it typically becomes more intense and happens more frequently, and they oftentimes become harder to predict, and resultantly the physical risk presents itself through the damage of property, infrastructure, livelihoods, and even in some cases, unfortunately, loss of lives that are caused by short-term extreme weather events or longer-term changes in climate and weather patterns. And I think as South Africans, we've seen over the last few years good examples locally in Cape Town in particular, where we had a serious drought, and in many other parts of our country, we're still seeing this taking place over the last couple of months. Areas still struggling with serious water issues. And then I think more recently, we've seen in the news areas such as Europe and America and Australia experiencing extreme flooding events or extreme heat waves, or even uncontrollable forest fires that authorities struggle to contain. So as we've heard in the theme 1 session that WWF presented on, South Africa is very vulnerable to climate change, as South Africa warms at roughly double the global average, and climate change is expected to impact South Africa, amongst other things, through increased temperatures, reduced water availability, even potentially reduced agriculture yields, and then shifting growing regions, and increased incidence of water and vector-borne diseases, as well as increased severity of communicable diseases and air pollution and so forth. Then transition risk. This can be described as the changes that go along with changes to regulation, policies, changes in technology, markets, and then reputations that are linked to the efforts of reducing our GHG emissions. So you can basically think about it as almost the fallout that results from our transition process into a lower carbon economy. And that we'll see as governments start to implement policies and regulations that will reduce GHG, or targeted at reducing our GHG emissions through, for example, carbon pricing, emission caps, broader tax adjustments, and carbon intensive, and then we'll also see carbon intensive business models become increasingly unprofitable, and that will lead to a transition to low carbon models. And if financial institutions then don't take account of this transition in their decision making and planning, that obviously leads to a big risk on their side, and will result in potentially reduced returns and things like stranded assets over the longer term. So with that in mind, let's unpack these two concepts a bit more, because they do pose varying levels of risk to organizations. So when considering physical risk resulting from climate change, these can either be driven or long-term shifts in climate patterns, also known as acute or chronic changes in climate patterns. So your acute risks, these stem from events that I've mentioned earlier, like cyclones, hurricanes, floods, and so forth. And chronic risk is physical risk that result in long-term shifts in climate patterns. So those play out over a much longer term period, and it presents itself through things like rises in sea level and chronic heat waves and so forth. So impacts on companies resulting from physical risk may have financial implications for organizations through, for example, direct damage to their assets, and indirect impacts from things like supply chain disruption, and their financial performance may also be affected through things like changes in water availability or sourcing and quality, and as well as things like food security and extreme temperature changes that could affect the organization's premises or their operations, supply chain, and even employee safety and so forth. So the other risk that I mentioned was transition risk. These are clustered in four kind of different buckets, namely policy and legal risk, technology risk, market risk, and then reputation risk. So your policy and legal risks, these can be categorized into two categories, and the policy actions, risk stems from policy actions that attempt to either constrain actions that contribute to the adverse effects of climate change, or policy actions that seek to promote adaptation to climate change. Some of these examples can include carbon pricing mechanisms, which aim to reduce GHG emissions, or adopting energy efficiency solutions, or encouraging water efficiency measures. And then the other risk that goes together with this is litigation or legal risk. So in recent years, I think this has been something that we've seen more globally at this stage. Actions around climate-related litigation claims that are being brought before courts by individuals such as property owners, municipalities, insurers, or shareholders, and other different public interest organizations. And reasons for this type of litigation would then include things like failure of organizations to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and the failure to adopt policies that are effectively address climate change, as well as inefficiency around disclosure of the material risks for organizations. And the value of loss and damage arising from climate change. So yeah, as we see increasing events and organizations experiencing losses or damages that relate to climate change, I think that really just opens up, I think, the opportunity, or the conversation that we'll most likely see increases in cases around that type of litigation. So the next risk that companies need to consider is technology risk, and as a result of very fast-paced technological improvements, or different innovations that we're seeing that support this transition to a low-carbon economy, energy efficient systems can have a significant impact on organizations. So the development and the use of energy efficiency and carbon capture or storage will affect the competitiveness of certain organizations and their products and distribution costs, and will ultimately demand and will ultimately result in a decreased demand for certain products and services from certain users. And to that extent, new technology, then it's also an opportunity, but to that extent, technology will then result in the displacement of old systems and processes, and really cause serious disruption to existing parts of the economic system, which obviously will result in some organizations coming out of this as winners and some losers, and if they don't adapt to some of these risks that companies could potentially face. So then just the second last risk that we look at is market risk, and markets will most likely be affected by climate change in a variety of different ways, given all of the different components there is to it. But one major way that it will be affected is through the shift in supply and demand of certain commodities and products and services, as climate risk and opportunities are being increasingly taken into account. So then I think this is probably one of the bigger risks that a lot of companies are realizing at this stage, is there is a reputational risk attached to not getting on board with the transition process, and being potentially seen as laggards in this transition process. So climate change has been identified as a potential source of reputational risk, which is tied to that change in consumer or community perceptions around that around organizations' contributions or detraction from this transition to a low carbon economy. So, like with all big transitions, there are risks, but there's also upsides to this, and it does present various opportunities to various different organizations and stakeholders, and some of these play out in things like increased resource efficiencies, so potentially certain products or services or even energy sources, making it possible for companies to cut on things like their energy consumption or water use. And yeah, like I mentioned, energy sources is another potential opportunity. I think in the South African context, this is a key opportunity for us as a country to leverage off, just given our placement and ability to engage in that renewable energy space. And yeah, I mentioned earlier the products and services. It could potentially be a risk for some organizations that are lagging in terms of this transition, but it does also present a large array of opportunities to innovate in terms of products and services, and to be able to address the transition through providing services and products that are able to address the climate crisis that we face. So in terms of markets, I mentioned earlier there's market risk, but there's also it also presents an opportunity for organizations that proactively seek opportunities in different markets or types of assets, and they'll be able to, if they leverage of that, be able to diversify their activities and better position themselves to this transition to a lower carbon economy. So the concept of resilience, this is basically the concept of being climate resilient, and involves organizations being able to develop that adaptive capacity to respond to climate change, to better manage the associated risks, and seize the various opportunities that I mentioned earlier, including to be able to respond to the transition risk and physical risks, as well as using the opportunities to improve efficiencies and design new production processes and developing new products. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are serious financial implications that these risks have, but could also have present great opportunities from a financial perspective for organizations. And in order to be able to make more informed investment decisions, investors and lenders, as well as insurance underwriters, need to be able to understand how these climate risks and opportunities are likely to impact different organizations' future financial positions, as it's reflected in their income statement, cash flow statement, and balance sheet, as outlined in this image. And fundamentally, the financial impacts of climate-related issues on an organization are driven by specific risks and opportunities to which that organization is exposed to, and its strategic and risk management decisions on managing those risks in ways like mitigation or transferring and so forth, and then also being able to seize upon those opportunities that some of these risks present. Yeah, and then I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but this image here just shows where the 4 major categories is located from a financial perspective, and the impact that these risks and opportunities that are specific to a company are able to have on revenues, a company's expenditure, assets and liabilities, as well as its capital and then financing. So yeah, with that being said, Corley is now going to take us, oh sorry, Corley, I actually forgot, I need to share the screen, or continue to share the screen, my apologies. Let me just mute myself here.
Thank you, Melanie.
Sorry.
Before you move to the next slide, Melanie, I thank you again for the opportunity to share with you today, and thank you for that great introduction. You know, both from Adrian and Tapelo, and then from Melanie setting further context. I think, you know, it may seem obvious, you know, that climate is a significant issue and it needs to be considered by boards. And as we noticed in the very first polling question, already many of you are saying your boards are considering it. I was intrigued, though, you know, that there's around 50% of people who are saying either they're not considering it or they're not sure. So, you know, that may speak to how messages are communicated, or you know, even for those who are considering it, you know, the extent to which it is considered. And so we wanted to use this opportunity today to share some practical principles that are available, you know, to help boards. And when I say boards, you know, you can bear in mind that we essentially mean the governing body or the highest governing entity within your organization. So, you know, for investment organizations or pension funds, that could be your board of trustees, or the board of directors, or the management committee of various entities. And what I think Melanie's presentation has demonstrated here, you know, are the kinds of risks that climate pose. And these are not, you know, these are not different kinds of risk categories than what organizations already deal with. And that already demonstrates that boards are able to engage with climate, and that they should engage with it, given the material risk categories that the climate issues can fall into. But before I kick off with that, I'd like to ask our colleague Safaka to share the second polling question. So the first one was just kind of to prompt you in terms of whether your board does already consider it, and the second one will delve a little bit deeper. You know, having now seen what Melanie was saying in terms of what the kinds of risks, physical risks, transition risks are, the categories that they fall into, you know, do you believe that boards generally, and where you sit particularly, have the necessary knowledge and understanding to manage it appropriately? Right, so there is no one answering yes on my side as yet. We see about 3/4 of the responses so far saying no. The remainder are saying they're not sure. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond. Most people have responded, and we are yet to see a yes to this question. So I think that that is telling, and hopefully this session today will help give you some practical guidance that you can take back to your organization, and in terms of the resources that are available, and also the basic kind of principles that one can use to, you know, to engage boards of directors on this. Other sessions will delve a little bit more into the actual day-to-day management of issues, but today I'd like to focus on the governance elements. Melanie, I think at this stage you can move us to the next slide, which really demonstrates to you here that you know, climate is it has to be an issue on the board. Melanie, I can't see the slide moving at my end just yet. There we go. So what we see here is that, you know, directors are fiduciaries of the entities that they deal with. They oversee corporate performance. They set the direction in terms of developing strategy, performing risk management, you know, engaging with various stakeholders and investors, and ensuring that robust systems and processes are in place from a compliance perspective, from a risk management perspective, etc. And it's well established that the board has ultimate accountability for these matters. They can delegate responsibility, but the buck stops with them at the end of the day. So those of you who are familiar with King 4 would know that King is well established in demonstrating or talking about the triple context and the intertwined nature of the environment where we operate between natural issues, the natural environment, economy, and society. And this is further unpacked in the concept of integrated thinking through the 6 capitals and the various interrelated capitals that companies not only draw from, but also contribute to as part of that process of creating value or even destroying value or attempts to preserve the value that they can create. And all of this needs to be driven from a governance perspective. So as climate poses such an existential risk to humanity, both from a planetary perspective, but also in terms of impacts on the global economy, the scale of this is never before seen. We're already seeing governments and businesses taking serious action and starting to push for acceleration of this transition to a new economic model. So then something like COVID comes along and people tend to think that it, you know, puts a spoke in the wheel, but if anything, it has demonstrated to us the importance of ensuring that that accelerated action is necessary. So the Paris Agreement that was concluded in 2015 already demonstrated and committed organizations and governments to a wholesale shift in how companies are governed. And this means for board directors placing the climate conversation at the center of your corporate strategic thinking, and that board decision-making processes now properly take into account this material risk to the organization. But as you have also demonstrated to us in your response to the poll, few directors still possess the specific interdisciplinary skills or even the conviction to effect this wholesale change of culture and behavior. However, I think what's important to note is it is a fiduciary duty. Directors have fiduciary duties that they owe to the organization. In the South African context, these fiduciary duties incorporate a number of good faith duties, acting in the best interests of the company, exercising proper judgment, and also the duty of care, skill, and diligence. And this means that they need to take reasonable precautions about reasonably foreseeable harms and things that can materially impact on the organization and its ability to not only create value, but to execute on its strategy and achieve its purpose. So the matters that are to be considered in the execution of your fiduciary duties as a director will vary depending on the kind of the organization, and it will also evolve over time. And that's why it's important that board level directors and leadership are kept up to speed and au fait with new developments so that they can reassess on a continuous basis what the materiality of the challenge to the organization will be. Because climate is a strategic risk to the organization, and as Melanie demonstrated, it filters down also into a number of other kind of risk categories. So feedback that we've already received, for example, and it was shared in the chat, a 2018 report by the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative already concluded that the fiduciary and other company law duties require company directors to act in the best interests of the organization, and these are likely to apply within the climate context as well. So this is legal opinion that supports the incorporation of climate as a fiduciary, as part of the fiduciary duties of directors to consider. In the South African context, we have the King Report, and we also have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which are particularly relevant to the framing of climate issues in relation to directors' duties. Just this past Friday, the IOD released a guidance document that was developed by the King Subcommittee on Climate Change, which not only confirms the importance of the board's role, but tries to also give some practical guidance and principles on dealing with it. And I'll address some of those recommendations a little bit later. Beyond the board of directors, though, when you even think about investor fiduciary duties, there's also legal opinion. A leading South African pension lawyer, Rosemary Hunter of the firm Fasken, published an opinion in April 2019 that found that the boards of South African pension and provident funds are also required per their fiduciary duties to fully consider climate risk when they're making investment decisions as fiduciaries. So a failure for directors and fiduciaries at investor level to consider these climate issues clearly demonstrates a failure of not only governance, but of fiduciary duty. And that could expose you to some of the legal risk that Melanie was referring to, and in the South African context also to personal legal liability at director level. However, there's a lot to be done in terms of helping to build capacity. These webinars are a great initiative to try and help starting to change that, giving boards more knowledge in terms of what the issues are that they need to deal with. If we move to the next slide, Melanie, the importance of governance as a founding consideration for boards to inform the response of an organization to climate is already demonstrated in the TCFD recommendations through the fact that governance is one of the 4 founding pillars that the recommendations deal with. So this focuses on what is disclosed, but given that the TCFD is one of the closest frameworks to a mandatory requirement and lots of noise being made internationally about it becoming mandatory in various jurisdictions in the very near future, it is one of the best frameworks that we have to help guide action. It does focus on disclosure, as I said, but obviously disclosure needs to be backed by action. And so this already helps organizations to think about what the areas are. If we had to unpack the TCFD recommendations, there are 2 core disclosure elements that are required. The first is describing the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, and secondly, describing management's role in assessing and managing the risks and opportunities. So that is aligned with corporate governance best practice in terms of the role of the board vis-a-vis management in implementing the direction set by the board. I'd like to just delve into the 2 of these a little bit very briefly before we go to some of the practical recommendations that we found in other sources. If you think about the board's oversight of climate-related issues, oversight speaks to a number of things. It speaks to the processes that are in place to inform board and subcommittees on climate-related issues. So how frequently are they discussing this at board level, and what are the processes for bringing in external knowledge or for creating upskilling opportunities at board level to make sure they are informed. And then further, how they consider these issues in the context of developing strategy, action plans, risk management policies, and also increasingly budgets and the financial impacts that the climate have been considered here, and business plans together with your KPIs and objectives. And then once that has been delegated to management, monitoring the implementation and performance. And then finally, from a board perspective, what we're looking at is how the board oversees the progress against the goals and the targets that they have set for management. Secondly, what the TCFD looks at in terms of the discussion of implementation and how management is implementing it, we would like to see organizations assigning climate-related responsibilities to senior level positions, you know, so that there is that responsibility at the senior level and also a communication channel right back to the board level. A description of what that structure entails at organizational level, and the processes by which management is informed. So you can see there's communication at board level, there's communication at management level, as well as monitoring. So that if those processes are in place, one can clearly see that the management is being done from a best practice perspective, and that is what the TCFD is expecting organizations to then also report on. Now, given that in the South African context, we're seeing regulators becoming increasingly emphatic about the need for companies and directors and other fiduciaries to adopt measures to address climate resilience, it would be prudent for boards that are well counseled to take a number of actions, and at the very basic level, climate risk needs to be on the board agenda. Climate risk identification needs to form part of that agenda, and the board needs to oversee that it takes place and that clear delegation to management is in place. These are kind of the starting points. You know, we will unpack further guidance that can be taken, but I think from a starting point, that is what we're looking at. So moving then to some practical guidance, and just before I do that, I'd like us to share the third polling question at this stage to get your input. And hopefully, you know, this will not be a difficult question if you agree with what we've been saying in terms of boards of companies being obligated to identify and manage climate risk in the same manner as any other strategic risks. Great, so no one disagreeing at my end as yet. And I think it's clear, you know, where maybe you might have come into this session thinking that, of course, it's a board issue. Of course, it's something that the board needs to consider because it seems obvious, it seems material. That is true. But I think what we'd like to also leave with you as a message is that there's a fiduciary duty increasingly for boards to be considering this issue. And that's why it's important to make sure that it happens. I see there is a question in the chat, Nicole, asking, is it realistic to propose that in order to be appointed as a director in a South African company, an individual should be expected to have achieved some sort of certifiable competence in climate issues, similar to the ethics training that has to be completed? Is there a scope to mandate a base level of climate competence for directors in order for them to attain and retain board seats? Nicole, I think that's a very interesting and practical suggestion. As you note, I mean, basic competencies and skills are part of the essentials that board directors need to have in place. And certainly one can see how corporate law is going to develop. Already we're seeing knowledge of ESG matters being, you know, beyond ethics, becoming quite a significant consideration. Right, so let's get to some practical suggestions. Let me just see, we're still doing well on time. So as I mentioned, the King Committee, as you know, the King Committee oversees the King Code and issues guidance papers from time to time on topics that are pertinent and particularly relating back to the King 4 Code on responsible, on good corporate governance. And this guidance paper was released just last week, and I'm sure they will share the link with you. It is available on the IOD's website. And the intention with this guidance paper is to help boards of directors relate the relevant principles of the King Code to climate specifically, and to contextualize it for them. And as I mentioned, this confirms already, the notion that climate is a board issue. And it highlights 7 areas of focus, or 7 themes, that boards of directors and others, again, King 4, as you would know, applies to any organization that strives for good corporate governance and in achieving 4 governance outcomes as set by King 4. So this is not only for boards of companies or listed entities, but any kind of organization, whether you are a municipality or a retirement fund. These principles can be made relevant to your context. Starting off at the top, the very first principle that this guidance deals with is leadership. And it refers back to the principles in King around the role of directors, and what we've already referred to in terms of duties to act in good faith and in the best interest of the organization, emphasizing that dealing with climate from a board perspective would be a proper and appropriate exercise of leadership from a director level. What it also emphasizes, and this speaks to Nicole's comment in the chat, is the need for boards to have the appropriate balance of knowledge, skills, experience, and diversity. That is a basic principle that boards of directors need to have these days. But what this guidance is suggesting is that climate become one of the considerations in achieving that appropriate balance. And the important point to note here is that the tone is set from the top, from the directors. And if it's clear that they are prioritizing climate, then that filters through the rest of the organization in terms of all of the principles of good governance and the outcomes that one is striving for in terms of legitimacy among your stakeholders, good control, effective control, ethical leadership, and good culture. The next principle, then, moving clockwise, is looking at strategy, risk, and opportunity. And these are also matters that are overseen by the board of directors. And what the guidance suggests here is that a climate risk assessment should consider the entire universe of the business and all of its activities. So considering the impact of climate on various aspects of the organization, and that links to the broad scope of climate risk, and also considering, not only physical issues, but transitional issues, compliance issues, and the like, and opportunities also being posed, and then considering how to integrate a response to those into the strategy of the organization. Once that has been done, you're moving to management and accountability systems, where the implementation of the strategy and the management of the risks and opportunities are delegated. However, the accountability, as I noted, is with the board to ensure that oversight and implementation happens, even though leadership at management level are responsible for implementing the direction set by the board. The fourth principle that is noted by this guidance is around the internalization of externalities. So this is quite a far-reaching concept. Many of you on this call are climate experts, and I'm sure there are many views around internalization of externalities, particularly in the climate context. And what this guidance suggests is for the organization to refocus its purpose in the economy and society. So it's talking about a broad principle level of internalizing externalities and understanding how the value that it puts back is as important as the value that it extracts. So it's that integrated thinking approach of how you draw from the capitals and contribute to the capitals, as well as, thinking about whether you're creating value or destroying value for yourself and for your stakeholders. And putting those holistic considerations within the context of climate and the risk that it poses to the organization. Because ultimately what this guidance suggests is that the board should aim to achieve a net positive impact on society and the economy. And for those of you who have been following research on reporting, would be aware that the Black Sun found in their latest research, I think it was October last year, that already many companies are shifting their reporting with a new focus on the purpose of the organization. And I'm sure it's, you know, one would be hard pressed to find an organization whose purpose is to destroy the planet that it relies on to exist. Moving on then to reporting and disclosure, this is where the TCFD recommendations focus, and that is the ultimate outcome of this process of taking leadership, considering strategy, implementing systems and processes, and how you consider the organization. We know that the demand for better disclosure of climate-related information is urgent, and organizations also need to go beyond reporting just the basics. The TCFD guidance is focused on that, and there's a lot of action in the reporting environment as well to enhance the quality of investor useful data that is reported by organizations. And so organizations from a leadership and governing perspective should consider the quality of climate-related information that they disclose. Assurance goes hand in glove with reporting, and assuring, you know, that the information you put out there is credible, because the pursuit of assurance is to enable the reliability and consistency of information that is put out there. And then finally, as an overarching consideration, throughout, to bear in mind any legal considerations, any new compliance initiatives or requirements that may come across the path, and also considering the exposure of the board and the individual directors to potential climate litigation within the company context. So that is what the King guidance addresses. It's very specific in terms of linking to the principles of the King Code, but giving guidance on the considerations that boards need to bear in mind. But how do you then go about implementing all of this? So the World Economic Forum, in collaboration with PwC, developed more guiding principles back in 2019. The document is entitled How to Set Up Effective Climate Governance on Corporate Boards. And while this dovetails really well with the more recent King guidance in terms of repetition of some of the basic practices, but it gives you very specific recommendations of practical actions that can be taken to assist the organization to implement best practice governance approaches in relation to integrating climate. So starting off then is to ensure that your board knows what they're dealing with. You would upskill them both on climate risk and opportunities, and this doesn't mean that everybody on the board becomes an expert in climate. There are various ways of doing it. If you strive for the principle that is posed in the leadership concept from the King Code, that your board has the appropriate structure and is composed of the appropriate balance of skills and expertise and experience and knowledge, you know, then that sharing of information can take place. Boards also rely on external inputs from external experts. This may well be necessary to retain in the climate context, given, you know, the deep scientific and technical nature of many of the issues. However, that awareness at board level is important. Then a further recommendation is to prioritize the climate risk at board level, and you can see that this is a refrain throughout the entire presentation. You know, and given that the board is accountable and that it links to fiduciary duty, that prioritization of risk at board level needs to be seriously considered to, you know, establish the materiality of the risk to the organization, which will inform the urgency of the response. Board structure links again to the upskilling. So considering what the most appropriate approach is for the board to provide leadership in terms of how it's structured, and then to feed that through to organizational structure for implementation. The risk and opportunity assessment, again, goes hand in glove with how climate risk is prioritized. As I noted, the guidance from the most recent King guidance document suggests that risk and opportunity assessment should be a broad one, looking at the entire scope of activities of the organization, rather than, for example, only focusing on its emissions or its carbon footprint, but looking at all activities and the climate-related impacts and opportunities and risks for the organization. Also looking at it from a short, medium, and long term, because climate is one of those classic issues that one can see having both short, medium, and long-term implications. Once this has been done, the WEF suggests, strategic and organizational integration from a board level. This is the filtering down into management and implementation, and through also aspects such as key performance indicators. This may follow in due course, once organizations are ready to start setting targets. This may not be right from day one. Another thing that's not necessarily in place from day one is considering the incentivization. Another hot topic, how to incorporate incentives and things like remuneration considerations around climate and other sustainability issues into the organization's remuneration policy, for example. However, as this is a complex issue, it is useful for the board right off the bat to discuss and consider what kind of incentivization would be appropriate for the organization to put in place for, enhancing some accelerated action and a sense of urgency around the issue, particularly where it is material to the company. Reporting and disclosure, we have spoken about, but just a reminder that the board remains ultimately accountable for ensuring that disclosure takes place and that the material climate-related issues are communicated in a timely fashion, and linking that to what they call the concept of exchange, which deals with your stakeholder relationship management, and how you not only report and engage with your critical investors as well as other key stakeholders, but also how you interact with peers, others in the market, for the sharing of information, which can loop back then to upskilling not only the board, but the rest of the organization. So the principles both from the King guidance and these practical recommendations from the World Economic Forum form a whole together that can help organizations to build an action plan for ensuring that you have the necessary governance structures and considerations in place to consider or to deal with and develop an appropriate response to climate, and to make sure that the organization can make better informed decisions from a strategic perspective and for investors to make better decisions. So the remainder of this presentation will deal with some practical examples of what we've seen. But before we move to those, I'd like to share just two last polling questions to get your feedback on what we have been talking about up to now. So when you think about board structure, as you know, there are certain structures that are prescribed in the South African context, but on climate, it's an evolving approach. So what is your thinking and what is your experience that you're seeing in your organization? Is there a focused subcommittee that deals with this, or an integrated approach across all of the subcommittees, or is it a combination of both? Okay, seeing the responses coming in, it looks quite spread, although the majority are saying they would either prefer or they're seeing a combination. In other words, where there may be a board subcommittee that is particularly responsible for climate issues, but that it's also integrated across other board subcommittees. Great. I think in reality, you know, one cannot really get away with not having an integrated approach, considering the risk issues and the reporting issues for which the audit committee has oversight responsibilities. You know, a combination approach is perhaps the best answer, and that is what we're also seeing in most organizations that certainly that I have dealt with. And what I'd like to do before I show the examples, there's one final polling question. I think we can close this one. Yes, there we go. So from your personal experience and your perspective, you know, what are you seeing? Is there an attempt to upskill the board or to mainly outsource? Okay, responses coming in. There's a couple that's not sure. Okay, if it's not always clear what the board is doing. Most tend to be following a combination of both, which is fantastic, because I think if we were seeing a majority only outsourcing, that is not ideal. We do want to be seeing an upskilling as well as potentially an outsourcing or an insourcing of knowledge, if you will. Okay, wonderful. Let me move to the examples then. So the first example that we have here on the screen, this page contains two examples, and the reason why I drew them out, there are others as well. We just picked these two for no particular reason, is to demonstrate from a reporting and disclosure perspective that organizations need to demonstrate it even at the integrated reporting level already in terms of their governance approach. So the first example we have here on the left is drawn from Sasol's latest integrated annual report. And it's in the governance section of their report where they deal with the role and responsibilities of the various subcommittees of their board. And they have a safety, social and ethics committee, which conducts a quarterly review of the management of sustainability issues. So that's that oversight element from the board perspective. And they were also involved in developing an emission reduction roadmap to support their targets. So they have a target in place for South African operations in relation to their emissions. And the board was involved in overseeing a roadmap to get there. And then also they review the climate change and sustainability report. So you can see in that example, there is clear disclosure that the board has specific and very hands-on involvement in the organization's oversight of climate issues. The second example is from Redefined Properties. And this is just to demonstrate that they have incorporated environmental sustainability and climate change as one of the key expertise elements that they try to integrate into their board. So this speaks to the diversity and balance of skills and composition of the board, you know, together with critical elements like leadership, financial knowledge, risk and opportunity management, compliance and governance. They've incorporated environmental sustainability and climate change. And then in demonstrating how that knowledge is spread throughout their board, they've shown there that around 30% of their board members have some measure of environmental sustainability and climate change experience or knowledge. So those are just two examples of companies that are reporting on what they're doing from a governance perspective. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Melanie at this stage, who will talk to us about some specific climate reports and how companies are demonstrating the governance approaches there. Thank you, Melanie.
Thanks, Corey, for that very thorough overview of your board governance and climate risk. I'm sure our participants attending today found it very useful, especially around some of the recommendations. Yeah, so I'm going to just share with you guys 3 examples. Again, like Corley mentioned, very at random, no particular reason we chose these. I think in recent months we've seen a good uptick in South African corporates publishing good standalone TCFD related reports. So there's many I think one can probably look at to discuss in this type of setting. But I think, yeah, I just wanted to use these as illustrative examples to show what boards are currently disclosing around governance and management's role and how they are conveying the responsibilities around oversight and the various functions and monitoring and so forth as it relates to governance of climate risk between boards and management's role. So here is one example that's taken from APSA's latest standalone TCFD report. This is an entire section that they just set out speaking to management and board's role as it relates to the governance of climate risk and opportunity. So you'll see that here on the left-hand side, at least on my screen, it starts off with stating that the board has oversight of climate-related risks, as well as mentioning the frequency with which they have oversight of these risks. Then you'll also see that they mention there towards the second last bullet point that climate risk has now been integrated into the company's overall risk management framework, which is great to see, which is one of the points made in that governance recommendations from the TCFD. And you'll also note that they've assigned board committee responsibility to these various committees. You'll often find those responsibilities sit within either your risk or social and ethics committee. I think it's there's various odd ones. I've also seen some interesting ones where it sits within IT, depending on the sector or the industry in which these companies operate. But typically you'll find it overlaps somewhere between risk and audit, and then social and ethics committees at board level. So moving on just a bit to in the middle of this slide, one can see they there expand on the board committee's functions, what they're responsible for, and then also mention here towards the middle part of the screen, management's role, indicating that the CEO is primarily held accountable for climate-related risk and opportunities. This is something that's been coming up more and more recently in some of the local as well as global reports as best practice, assigning a particular individual within an organization that has that particular role that they need to fulfill. And moving on to the more the last section of the slide, you'll see they explain very well in detail management's the process that management has to inform the board as well as various other committees at an EXCO level around how they monitor climate risk, and then they also provide a illustrative image to show where how the lines of reporting are drawn between the board and EXCO and the different committees involved in reporting on climate risk. The next 2 slides are a combination of Nedbank TCFD standalone reports. I'll jump between them because this is a nice visual to just show you. They have a much more detailed visual that they've provided, and really clearly shows how the information from management level up to board is communicated between the different units, as you can see here at the bottom, stemming from the various different business units. They have a set climate task team that's responsible, and that's chaired by their chief risk officer, that then ultimately reports up to the board level. I just want to see here. Oh, the one thing that I wanted to point out that relates nicely, I think, to the second last polling question that Corley had around kind of where one houses this at a board committee level, and do you integrate it or do you have a standalone function? One can see here clearly that they do have particular board committees that oversee this climate-related risk and opportunity, or functions to that. But you'll also see in the middle of the screen, and it's a block that I did not particularly add, but it follows here, where they say that the climate risk and opportunities, because it spans different types of kind of areas within the business, there's the other board committees that don't primarily have that function or function of oversight are also expected to kind of keep an eye on climate related matters, given that it does have the potential to impact different facets of the business, which I think is interesting. I don't recall in the last while particularly having seen that pointed out, and I think it's great to see that there are examples of organizations realizing that because climate risk spans different areas and impacts, has different impacts on the business, it is a function that's not that cannot be fulfilled in isolation or in silos. It needs to be a multi-pronged approach how you kind of have oversight of this. And then here you can clearly also see that they describe what the board has oversight, and what their various responsibilities are relating to board committees and the functions they have assigned to them, and then also a very thorough explanation around management's oversight and the processes that are involved at a management level to inform the board around climate-related issues, and how management then monitors these climate-related matters. So this is the visual, just illustrating it graphically to the reader, how the information will basically flow. And I think this makes it very clear the various internal stakeholders that are responsible for managing this as a whole. The next example that we have, and this spans a few slides that I'm going to go through just because it gets a bit crowded on a number of slides, but we have the Investec example here, where they illustrate that also, again, the board has is the highest governance within the organization, and they illustrate or discuss here how many times a year this board meets, and has oversight of that, as well as explaining which committees are responsible to feed that back into the board, as well as the frequency with which they meet and functions that they serve. This is just a more detailed slide on it, going into a bit more detail around the various directors that sit at the Social and Ethics Committee, and how many times they then meet. And the on the right-hand side, it shows very detailed, in exact words, the various climate-related elements that this committee is responsible for considering at their level. So I think what is great here, and also relates to a comment made earlier, I think by Corley, is, it relates to that recommendation around incentivization. This is just clearly illustrating that there is different targets attached for executive remuneration, long-term and short-term, as it relates to broader ESG targets, which should include things like climate risk. Yeah, and this last slide here just shows at a management level, also here again, indicate or identifying a particular individual that's responsible and takes, has accountability to climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as the responsibilities that at a management level they take care of, and what their particular functions are to address that. Yeah, so these are just a few examples. We have many new reports coming out almost on a monthly basis, where you can go and have a look and see how companies are starting to align themselves with some of these reporting or the recommendations as it relates to TCFD, and to clearly give stakeholders that are using this information to make decisions a clear idea of how the board has oversight, what processes are involved at a board and management level to report on climate risk to the board, and how the board monitors, as well as management levels monitors climate risk then at the end of the day. So yeah, before we end off, I believe Adrian is going to take us now into closing and making just a few comments on some of the resources used for presenting this part or this webinar today.
Thank you very much, Milani, and thank you so much, Corley, for your respective presentations on the webinar. Yes, we just wanted to say that these were a number of the sources or the references that we used in putting together today's content. These will all be referenced and linked in the slides, the webinar slides, which we'll be making available via the DNA website. So please do have a look there, and we tried to cover as much as we could in the space of today's webinar, but please do have a look at these resources in your leisure time, and I'm sure you'll find good value, as did we, in reviewing these specific resources. As we move to kind of wrapping up the webinar, we do have a few minutes if anybody would like to raise any questions. Corley made the invitation to invite some of you to maybe share any particular practical experiences or challenges that your organization may currently be having when it comes to the governance and management of climate issues. I see there haven't been any takers in terms of responding to that question. But now is the opportunity to raise any questions or comments that you may wish to make. You can indicate that you'd like to speak verbally and we can unmute you. Alternatively, feel free to use the chat function. We'll just give a few seconds to see if there are going to be any responses there. Perhaps while we wait for any questions which might be forthcoming, I'm going to ask our colleagues to load the post-webinar feedback survey link. UK PACT as the funder requires us to do a formal kind of feedback survey of webinar participants. If we could ask you just to take 5 minutes to please complete that online survey. We obviously are moving towards the end of our initial foundational webinar series, with the last 2 webinars in the series coming up, one tomorrow on the impacts of climate risk, being presented by WWF South Africa, 10 o'clock South African time tomorrow morning. Please do join us if you're interested in that. That same webinar theme will be repeated again next week. So please do join us for those. The webinar feedback link has now been placed into the chat function. Please won't you take 5 minutes just to complete that. And do remember that if you're a retirement fund trustee or principal officer, we'll gladly issue you with a 2 Batseta CPD certificate, which can count towards your annual CPD recognition. Lastly, gender equity and social inclusion considerations are a key element of this UK PACT funded project and series of projects around the world. So I'm going to ask Safaku just to load a few final polling questions which speak to JESI requirements. And this is the interaction between gender equity and social inclusion and climate risk. And often it's women and marginal members of society that are most affected. And that's why it's so important that we do have a just climate transition. So the question is, do you feel gender equity and social inclusion concerns are being considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures in SA? Yes, no, or not sure? Please, would you let us have your answer for that question? So it looks like for most of you, there's still more kind of learning required, and a lot of folk have said not sure, almost 80%, whereas 20% said no, meaning that there should be more of a focus on JESI, gender equity and social inclusion matters when it comes to climate risk. If we can have the next poll, please, Safaku. Thanks. The second JESI question is, what priority gender equity and social inclusion issues and concerns would you like to see featured in an analysis and reporting toolkit, which this project will be developing? Gender equality, equity, social inclusion, or are you not sure? So currently we have the bulk of the responses at social inclusion, followed by gender equality and not sure. Right, so 60% for social inclusion, 20% for gender equality, and also 20% people saying they're not quite sure. All right, Safaku, do we have a third poll for JESI?
No, Adrian, that's all. Okay,
super. Thanks, Safaku. So with that, it's really just an opportunity to thank our speakers, Mr. Tapelo Tladi, on behalf of the British High Commission and UK PACT. Thank you very much for your formal welcome and opening remarks at the start of the webinar. Thank you very much to Melanie Smith and Corley LaRue for presenting us with a very comprehensive kind of introduction to why climate risk matters are material and why it's important for boards of directors or governing bodies to take the appropriate action around managing climate risk. We trust that you've benefited from attending today's webinar. Please do let us have your feedback via that post-webinar survey, and do stay in touch. You can keep in touch via the email address provided on the slide, but you will also have our project team contact details. So please do keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks very much and enjoy the day further. Take care. Bye-bye.